Li Ming's life had always been measured in quiet routines. He wasn't the type to chase excitement, nor did he need it. Every day was a series of predictable steps: wake up at 7 a.m., prepare a cup of black coffee, work at his desk, and spend long hours analyzing financial data. He would zone out sometimes, lost in the numbers, but that was just the way he liked it. His apartment was small, nothing more than a basic one-bedroom on the outskirts of the city. It wasn't much, but it was his. And he liked it that way. But on this particular morning, as Ming adjusted the tie he'd worn hundreds of times before, something shifted in the air. He felt it, a strange, subtle hum that was like a whisper in his mind. The feeling was hard to pin down, like something was just a little off, but he shrugged it off as he stepped out the door. He had bigger things to worry about, like the presentation he had to deliver that afternoon. His phone buzzed, but Ming ignored it. He had trained himself to avoid distractions, to be like a machine, detached from the world's emotional clamor. After all, emotions had always been his greatest curse. His ability to feel, know, to experience other people's emotions was nothing short of overwhelming. It was like being plugged into a constant stream of someone else's deepest fears, desires, and regrets. As a child, he'd learned to shut it all out, retreating into silence. But today, it felt as though the world was pressing in from all sides, and he couldn't shake the sensation that something was going to happen. He walked the same route to work, his mind wandering in the way it always did. But today, something was different. There were people on the street, moving with purpose, their footsteps too synchronized, too mechanical. Ming felt the first stirrings of unease creep up his spine. He quickened his pace, but the sensation only deepened. It was as though everyone around him was watching, and then, just as quickly, he felt someone tap him on the shoulder. He spun around. A man in a sharp, black suit stood before him, his face expressionless. Before Ming could speak, he was grabbed by the shoulders, and within seconds, everything blurred. His legs went weak, and the world around him spun like a carnival ride. He tried to scream, but his voice was lost. Everything faded when Ming regained consciousness. His head felt heavy, like it was made of lead. The air was thick and sterile, and the dim light made his surroundings look like the inside of a futuristic lab, a place that didn't belong in the real world. His body was restrained, bound to an uncomfortable chair with cold metal cuffs. The buzz in his mind was louder now, an unnerving chorus of voices, most of them unfamiliar, but some eerily familiar. His own heartbeat thundered in his ears. He wasn't alone. Across from him stood a woman. Her dark hair framed a face that looked too perfect, too cold. She had the air of someone who was always in control. Ming's first instinct was to ask her who she was, what was happening, but as he opened his mouth, something held him back. Her eyes were sharp, like a hawk's, and they bored into him with an intensity that made him feel exposed. "You're awake," she said flatly. Her voice was like steel. "Good." Ming felt a chill run through him. He tried to speak again, but no words came. Something was off. His throat felt dry, his body unnaturally heavy. The woman raised a hand, and suddenly, a screen flickered to life behind her. Images flashed across it, faces of people Ming didn't recognize, their eyes wide with fear or desire, their expressions twisted by emotions he could feel more than he could understand. "You're not just any ordinary man, Ming," she continued, her tone slipping into something more conversational, more insidious. "You have a gift. Or maybe it's a curse. Either way, we're going to use it." Ming's heart pounded in his chest. He wanted to resist, to fight, but his body betrayed him. He couldn't move. He couldn't even speak. His mind raced, but the more he struggled, the more it felt like his thoughts were being pulled in different directions. He could hear their emotions, feel the pressure of their anxieties pressing in on him. He was being dragged into something darker, something bigger than his own personal hell. The woman watched him with a cold smile. "You're going to help us, Ming. Whether you want to or not." It was then that Ming understood the terrible truth. These people, this group, were hackers. But they weren't interested in stealing credit card numbers or corporate secrets. No, they were far more dangerous. They were after the emotions of the powerful, of the influential. They had developed technology to breach the mind, to dig deeper into people's psyches than any digital system could ever do. And Ming, with his extraordinary sensitivity, was the key. They could use him to invade the minds of their targets, to extract their secrets, manipulate their feelings, and twist their desires. Vera, the woman in front of him, was the leader. She explained that the operation they were running was unlike anything the world had ever seen. They had cracked the code to the human subconscious. They were building a new world order, one where emotions could be controlled, bought, and sold like any other commodity. I see it in you, she continued, as though reading his mind. You already know what it feels like to be overwhelmed, to be burdened with other people's feelings. But now, you'll see how useful it is. You'll help us break into the minds of the rich, the powerful, and the corrupt. You'll be our inside man. Ming's stomach twisted. There was no way out. He had been trapped, ensnared in a web of power he couldn't even comprehend. His mind raced, but no plan formed. He couldn't escape, not yet. He was too valuable, and his ability too rare. In the hours that followed, Ming was forced to participate in their operations. His role was simple: enter the minds of high-profile individuals and retrieve their most intimate thoughts, their deepest secrets. With each emotional dive, Ming's mind felt more fragmented, more contaminated by the emotions he encountered. The system they had developed was sophisticated, a web of machines that interacted with his heightened senses. As he tapped into the minds of their targets, he was plunged into their deepest fears, desires, and regrets. At first, it felt like an invasion. But slowly, it became clear, this was a form of control. A way to bend people to their will. Ming was horrified, but part of him was fascinated. There was an eerie allure to it, to the power of it all. For the first time, he wasn't just an observer. He was in control of the emotions, and it was intoxicating. Yet, as he continued to dive deeper into others' psyches, a new realization began to grow inside him: he was losing himself. His own emotions, his own identity, began to blur, dissolving into the chaos of others' feelings. He was becoming a shell of a man, an instrument for those who controlled him. And the worst part? He wasn't sure if he wanted to stop. The days blurred together for Ming as he continued to work under Vera's watchful eye. Each emotional dive into the minds of the powerful felt like a descent into madness. It wasn't just the feelings he encountered, it was the overwhelming flood of memories, desires, and subconscious thoughts that seemed to take root in his own mind. As he forced himself deeper into the psyche of each target, he felt his own sense of self unraveling, thread by thread. The first few dives had been a blur. He didn't question it too much. The technology was disorienting, a strange mix of invasive and controlling. But each time he was asked to dive, he was reminded, his ability to feel emotions was no longer his own. It belonged to them now. One day, after a particularly difficult hack into the mind of a corrupt corporate CEO, Ming found himself sitting in a darkened room, the sharp hum of the machines and the soft tapping of Vera's heels on the cold concrete floor the only sounds in the air. His head ached, his body drained. It wasn't just fatigue, it was a gnawing sensation that something vital was slipping away, leaving him more hollow with each passing day. Not bad, Vera said, breaking the silence. Her voice was cool, almost dismissive. She never bothered to make it comforting. You're getting better at it. Ming didn't answer. He wasn't sure if he could anymore. I think you're ready for a new target, she continued. Someone more important. Someone who could tip the scales for us. Ming's heart tightened. He had grown numb to the idea of his own worth, but the constant pressure of these emotional invasions had taken its toll. He had no agency anymore, no control. The idea of diving deeper into someone's mind made him sick. But it wasn't a choice. Vera's sharp eyes didn't leave him as she spoke again. a hint of amusement in her voice. "I think you'll find this one interesting." Ming didn't look up. He didn't need to. He knew the drill by now. His hypersensitivity to emotions was something Vera had never let him forget that he was her instrument. That his talent wasn't a gift, it was a tool. The thought of diving into the psyche of another high-profile target didn't sit well with him. He was already losing his grip on reality, the lines between his own feelings and those of others blurring more each day. But what could he do? His hands were shaking as he sat in front of the machine, the electrodes attaching to his temples, the strange comfort of the wires settling against his skin. His heart raced, not from fear but from the sheer weight of knowing what was about to happen. This wasn't just an invasion of someone else's mind, it was an invasion of his own soul. With a final push, the machine hummed to life, and Ming was once again submerged in the endless ocean of another person's emotions. The world around him seemed to crack apart as the mind of his new target unfolded before him. He found himself inside the thoughts of Yuan, a ruthless politician with ties to a global corporation. A man who wielded more power than Ming could ever understand, whose ambitions reached beyond anything Ming had seen before. It was easy to see why Vera would target him. The man was a web of insecurities, unchecked desires, and deep fears. The kind of man who thought he had control over everything, but deep down, was completely undone by his own fragility. Ming had to remind himself to focus. But it was hard. The deeper he went, the more he felt Yuan's rage, his greed, his constant need for more. He was swept up in a violent storm of emotions, an endless cycle of craving power, control, and admiration. Ming had learned to lock himself away in these situations, to push his own emotions aside and focus on the task at hand. But with Yuan, it was different. His emotions were raw and contagious, crashing over Ming like a wave that he couldn't escape. There were moments, tiny flickers, where Ming wondered if Yuan was actually the one who had lost control, not just the people around him. Was Yuan the puppet, just as Ming was? But Ming didn't have time for questions. He had to get the information Vera wanted. He pushed deeper into Yuan's subconscious, trying to extract the most intimate secrets that would give the hackers leverage. Yuan's mind was a battlefield, a twisted combination of suppressed desires and glaring weaknesses. Ming felt the man's fear of exposure, his constant worry that someone would uncover his darkest secret, his reliance on manipulation. Yuan was a man who thought he could control everyone, but the truth was, he was terrified of being controlled. The man who commanded entire governments and corporations couldn't even control himself. Ming found himself slipping into something darker, feeling the creeping tug of Yuan's paranoia. It was almost impossible to maintain his distance, to hold on to his own sense of self. He didn't want to be caught up in this world, to be dragged into this manipulation. But the deeper he went, the more he felt himself lose control, and then, just as suddenly, everything went black. Ming gasped, sitting up, the machine humming softly as the wires were removed from his head. His heart was racing, his body drenched in sweat. His mind was reeling, and his own emotions felt foreign to him now, overcome by the weight of what he had just experienced. Vera was standing over him, her cold gaze studying him intently. "You're slipping," she said, as though noticing his disorientation. Ming didn't answer. He couldn't answer. "Next time," she said softly, almost as a command, "don't get so lost in the target. Control yourself, Ming." But how could he? How could he control himself when he was constantly swimming in other people's minds? When he was constantly drowning in the flood of their emotions? The deeper he went, the harder it was to remember who he was. Each new dive into the minds of their targets seemed to erode his own sense of identity, his own emotional truth. How much of Ming was left now? Was he still the same man, or was he just a shell, a vessel for the emotions of others? As the days passed, Ming felt himself sinking further. He spent hours in the dimly lit room, the machines, the screens, and the sterile environment his only company. His once clear mind was now clouded with fragmented memories of the people he had invaded. He couldn't escape it anymore. The weight of his own fractured emotions was becoming unbearable, and he couldn't even tell which feelings were his. It wasn't until he met Kai, a young hacker who worked for the group, that he realized there might be a way out. Kai had always seemed distant, his eyes full of regret, like a man who didn't belong. They spoke in hushed tones, the only time Ming had felt anything resembling human connection since being trapped in this world. "They don't care about you, you know," Kai said one evening, his voice low, as if fearing the walls themselves might hear. "They never did." Ming looked at him, too tired to question what Kai meant. "Who?" he asked, barely whispering, "Them." "Vera, all of them. They'll use you until you break. And when you do, they'll find someone else." Ming's head was spinning. Was it possible? Could he escape? Could he even fight back? "Get out while you can," Kai added. "Before it's too late." But Ming wasn't sure he could escape anymore. He was no longer sure of anything, his mind was slipping away, his emotions more entangled with the world of the hackers than with his own life, and yet, there was a part of him that wanted to escape. Wanted to find something real. To reclaim the part of himself that had been lost in the chaos of everyone else's minds. But how could he escape when he was tethered to their will? The next few days felt like a blur, each moment melting into the next. The world outside the bunker was distant, unreachable. Ming was a part of this system now, he had to be. He had no other choice, but as the pressure mounted, as the emotional manipulations continued, something in Ming finally snapped. He began to plan. It was vague at first, a quiet whisper in the back of his mind, but it grew louder. He had to break free. The plan was dangerous. It would require him to exploit his own emotions, to use the very thing that had always been his burden as a weapon. He would have to dive into the heart of the operation itself, into Vera's mind, and unravel the secrets that kept him in chains. Ming sat in the dim light of the bunker, his hands trembling. The wires from the machines were still connected to his scalp, his head heavy with the aftereffects of the emotional dive into Yuan's mind. He could still feel the residue of Yuan's paranoia gnawing at him, that gnawing doubt that whispered in the back of his mind. Was he really in control? Or was he just another cog in this machine, just as lost as the others? But something had shifted in him. A spark had ignited. For the first time since his capture, Ming didn't just feel like a passive participant. He wanted out. The walls felt as though they were closing in on him, and he could hear the sharp sound of Vera's voice again, her words searing through his mind. "Control yourself, Ming." Every time she said it, it was like a needle to his heart. She had no idea how much control he had already lost. How much control he was never supposed to have. He sat there for what felt like hours, trying to breathe, trying to calm himself. He could hear Kai's words echoing in his head. "They'll use you until you break. And when you do, they'll find someone else." But Ming wasn't ready to break. Not yet. He had to hold on. It wasn't the fear of physical pain that terrified him anymore, it was the realization of what they were doing to him. The hackers had made him a tool, a weapon in a battle for control over others' minds, their desires, their innermost secrets. His emotions were no longer his own, they had been hijacked, repurposed, molded to fit their plan. Every dive into the minds of their targets chipped away at his very identity, threatening to leave him as nothing more than a hollow shell. He thought of Yuan again, of the man's endless hunger for power, his insatiable need for control. Ming had seen it all, felt it all. But what struck him the most was how terrified Yuan was of losing that control. He wasn't the puppet master, he was the puppet, and every decision, every action was rooted in fear. It was a weakness that made him human, a weakness that made him just like Ming. Ming closed his eyes, pushing the images away. If he didn't, if he let them consume him, there would be nothing left of him. He couldn't let that happen. Not now. Kai had given him the key, the secret backdoor. The possibility of escape. But how could Ming, who was already so deep within the hacker's world, use it? How could he manipulate the system when the system had already manipulated him so thoroughly? Vera had underestimated him. She thought he was just a tool, a puppet to be used, but what she didn't understand was that even a puppet could cut its strings if it knew where to look. And Ming had found the strings. He had found the weakness in their operation, the point where it all began. Vera herself, for weeks, Ming had watched her, studied her cold, calculating movements. He'd listened to her voice, absorbed the smallest details of her expressions. He had come to understand her better than she understood herself. Vera's own emotions were buried deep, too deep for anyone to see, but Ming had glimpsed them once. The shadows behind her sharp, commanding exterior were there, and Ming could feel them. He had sensed it when he first entered her mind during a dive. Her guilt, her unhealed wounds. It was in that moment, submerged in the depths of her subconscious, that Ming understood how to break her. She wasn't invincible. She wasn't all-knowing. She was just as human as the rest of them. The question now was, could he exploit that? He had no choice. It was the only way out. Ming knew it wouldn't be easy. Every moment he spent within this system made him weaker. His mind was on the verge of cracking, and if he failed now, he would never be able to reclaim himself. But as he stood up from the chair, his legs unsteady, his mind clearer than it had been in days, he realized he didn't have time to waste. He had to act. The plan was simple in theory, but the execution would be far from easy. Ming would need to infiltrate the core of the hackers' system, bypassing their security and using the very technology they had developed to break free. The emotional manipulation that had been his curse could now be turned against them. He had to get to Vera, tap into the one part of her psyche that had always been a weakness. The part she kept hidden, even from herself. With a deep breath, Ming walked toward the door, moving as silently as possible. He wasn't sure if anyone would notice him leaving. He wasn't sure if anyone was paying attention anymore. The bunker felt colder than usual, the silence deafening as he made his way through the corridors. Every step felt like it was taking him further from the life he once knew, but closer to the person he had to become. He reached the control room. The heart of their operation. Inside, Vera was at her desk, her fingers flying over the keyboard as she monitored their latest targets. She didn't notice Ming standing there, just outside the door. Now, the real challenge began. Ming closed his eyes, focusing. He reached out, not physically, but mentally. He'd done it before, entered minds, manipulated thoughts, but this time, it wasn't a target's emotions he was after. It was Vera's. He let his mind extend, the familiar hum of the machine behind him amplifying his connection to the world around him. But this time, it was different. He was no longer just a vessel, he was a part of the system. A part that could control it. He could feel her. Her mind was like a labyrinth, but Ming had studied her, learned its patterns. He forced himself deeper, into the parts of her that she had locked away, the fears and regrets she kept buried under layers of control. He found it, the trigger. Ming pressed forward, tapping into her deepest, most fragile emotions, the ones she had buried so far down, she had forgotten they existed. And in that moment, he did what he had never done before. He let himself feel it too. Her pain. Her guilt. Her unhealed wound that festered in the dark corners of her mind. Vera's hand froze over the keyboard. Ming felt the panic rise in her, the terror of being exposed. It was enough. He had pushed her to the edge. She turned, her eyes wide in disbelief. "What have you done?" she whispered, her voice shaking for the first time. It was an almost imperceptible crack, but it was there. And Ming, for the first time in a long while, felt a flicker of hope. "I've learned everything I need to," Ming said, his voice calm, steady. He wasn't sure how much longer he had before the system began to fight back, before Vera and her team realized what was happening. But for now, he was in control. Vera's face twisted in fury, but Ming was already moving. He yanked the wires from the machine, severing the connection. The hum of the machines faded, replaced by the deafening silence of freedom. For the first time since his abduction, Ming felt the full weight of his own emotions returning, and he couldn't help but let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. But it wasn't over. Not yet, Vera lunged at him, but Ming was faster. His body was fueled by adrenaline, his mind clearer than it had been in weeks. He grabbed the nearby console and smashed it, the glass shattering with a satisfying crack. He was free, and there was no turning back. Vera's scream echoed behind him, but Ming didn't look back. He had one goal now: escape. The bunker was no longer his prison, it was his battlefield. As he ran, the weight of his actions began to settle on him. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, he felt like he could face it. His mind, fractured and scarred, was his own again, and that was enough.